In the beginning, there was silence. Not the silence of emptiness, not the hollow, meaningless silence of a void without purpose. This was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a universe holding its breath, waiting for something ancient and inevitable to stir from the depths of a mystery so profound that time itself had been invented merely to contain it. The desert stretched in every direction, an ocean of golden sand that rolled and undulated like the frozen waves of a petrified sea. The sun crept above the eastern horizon with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had been rising for billions of years and would continue rising for billions more. Its light, thick, golden, almost liquid in its richness, spilled across the sand and transformed the landscape into a canvas of amber and shadow, each dune casting a long, dark twin of itself that pointed westward like a finger indicating the direction from which the night had retreated. The wind moved through this ancient place with a voice of its own, not howling, not screaming, but whispering in a language older than any language humans had ever spoken, a language of sand and heat and time, a language that carried within its syllables the compressed history of everything that had ever happened on this piece of earth and everything that ever would. And somewhere in this vast, ancient, whispering landscape, something was about to happen that would connect the beginning of time to its end. The old man stood alone. He had been standing here for what might have been minutes or might have been hours. Time had become unreliable lately, stretching and compressing in ways that made his aged mind dizzy. His white robe, once clean and crisp, now stained with the dust of 1,000 desert miles, hung from his thin shoulders like a sail from a mast, catching the wind and billowing outward in slow, rhythmic pulses that made him look less like a man and more like a breathing landmark, a feature of the landscape, a thing that had always been here and would always be here, as permanent as the dunes, as enduring as the sky. His beard was long and silver, each hair a thread of accumulated years, and the wind moved through it with the familiar intimacy of an old friend running fingers through the hair of someone they had known for decades. His hands hung at his sides, open, palms forward, fingers slightly spread, in a posture that was simultaneously passive and receptive, the posture of a man who was not reaching for anything, but was prepared to receive whatever might come. He was looking at the sky. Not at anything specific in the sky, not at the sun, not at the few remaining stars that clung to the western horizon like reluctant guests at a party that had ended hours ago, not at the thin wisps of cloud that scratched across the blue like marks left by the fingernails of angels. He was looking at the sky itself, at the vast, curved, impossibly deep bowl of atmosphere that arched above him from horizon to horizon, containing within its transparent embrace everything that existed between the earth and whatever lay beyond. He was looking for something. He had been looking for it for years, perhaps decades, perhaps his entire life. He could not have told you what it was because he did not know. He only knew that it was real, that it existed somewhere in the space between the visible and the invisible, between the known and the unknowable, between the world his eyes could see and the world his soul could sense but never quite grasp. He was looking for the answer to a question he had never been able to fully articulate. A question that had haunted him since childhood, when he had first looked up at the stars and felt, not thought, but felt in the deepest and most inarticulate chambers of his young heart, that the universe was not what it appeared to be, that behind the curtain of the visible world something was watching, something was waiting, something was patient in a way that suggested it had been patient for a very, very long time. His eyes were the color of desert stone, a warm, weathered brown that had faded over the years from rich chocolate to pale amber, the way all colors fade when exposed to enough sunlight and enough time. But within those fading eyes, something burned, something that had not faded, something that grew brighter with each passing year, each passing decade, as if the dimming of his physical sight had been compensated by the intensification of another kind of vision, a vision that operated not through the mechanics of lens and retina, but through a faculty that had no name in any language the old man knew. The clouds reflected in those ancient eyes, white and gray and gold, moving slowly across the surface of his irises, like ships crossing a harbor. And behind the reflection of the clouds, deeper, barely visible, was the reflection of something else, something that was not in the sky at all, something that existed in the space between the old man's perception and the reality that his perception was struggling to decode. He had seen it before, in dreams that left him sweating and shaking in the blue darkness before dawn, in moments of intense study when the ancient texts he devoted his life to seemed to rearrange themselves on the page, the letters shifting and recombining into messages that vanished the moment he tried to read them directly. In the faces of strangers who passed him on the street and met his gaze for a fraction of a second too long, their eyes holding a flicker of recognition that made no sense because he had never seen them before and would never see them again. Something was trying to reach him. Something was trying to tell him something, and he had spent his entire life trying to listen. The sandstorm appeared on the horizon without warning. One moment the western sky was clear, a pale, washed-out blue that spoke of distance and emptiness and the endless patience of uninhabited places. Then a wall of darkness rose from the desert floor, like a curtain being drawn across a stage, blocking out the light, erasing the horizon, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. The old man watched the approaching storm with an expression that was not fear. He had survived sandstorms before, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. He knew their rhythms, their patterns, their moods. He knew how to read the color of the advancing wall to estimate its intensity, how to judge the speed of its approach by the rate at which it consumed the visible landmarks, how to position his body and protect his lungs and wait with the patience that decades of desert living had taught him for the fury to pass. But this storm was different. He could feel it before he could see it, a pressure in the air, a thickness, a weight that had nothing to do with sand particles and wind speed. This storm carried something within it, something that was using the storm as a vehicle, a conveyance, a disguise. The sand and the wind and the darkness were not the point. They were the wrapping. Inside the wrapping was something else entirely. The old man tightened his robe around his body, turned his back to the approaching wall of sand, and began to walk. Not away from the storm. There was no outrunning a desert storm, and he knew it. He walked toward shelter, toward the place where he had been spending his nights for the past few weeks, toward the cave in the hillside where an ancient scroll waited on a stone table, its secrets partially revealed, its mysteries partially penetrated, its deepest truths still locked behind a barrier of comprehension that the old man had been battering against with the full force of his considerable intellect. The scroll was calling him back. It had been calling him for weeks, months, perhaps years, a silent, persistent, patient summons that he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears, a gravitational pull, like the pull of the earth on a falling stone, invisible, intangible, irresistible. He walked toward the cave. He walked toward the scroll. He walked toward the mystery. And behind him, the storm followed. The path to the cave wound through ruins, Ancient ruins, ruins so old that they had ceased to be recognizable as any specific type of building and had become instead a general expression of the concept of decay. Stone returning to sand, structure returning to chaos, the temporary ambitions of builders returning to the permanent indifference of the earth. Broken columns jutted from the sand at angles that suggested catastrophe, not the slow crumbling of neglect, but the sudden violence of destruction, as if whatever force had reduced these buildings to rubble had done so in a single, terrible moment. The old man walked among these ruins with the comfortable familiarity of someone passing through his own neighborhood. He knew every fallen pillar, every collapsed wall, every pile of shattered stone. He had studied them, he had measured them, he had sketched their layouts and compared them to descriptions in ancient texts, trying to determine what civilization had built here, what purpose the buildings had served, what catastrophe.
The scholar left the underground chamber as the sun was setting, painting the narrow alley above in stripes of orange and purple that looked like the sky was bruising. His mind was a storm of competing thoughts, each one clashing against the others like waves in a tempest, producing a confused roar of intellectual and emotional turbulence that made it difficult to think clearly about anything at all. He needed air. He needed space. He needed the desert. He walked out of the city as the gates were closing for the night, slipping through the narrowing gap between the massive wooden doors just before they sealed the city against the darkness. The guards watched him go without comment. An old man leaving the safety of the walls for the open desert was either a madman or a mystic, and in this part of the world, the distinction between the two was not always clear. The scholar walked until the city was a dark shape behind him, its walls and towers reduced to a silhouette against the fading sky. He walked until the sounds of civilization, voices, animals, the clanking of metal and the creaking of wood faded into the vast silence of the open desert. He walked until there was nothing around him but sand and stone and sky and the immense, overwhelming, terrifying emptiness of a landscape that had existed for millions of years before the first humans set foot upon it. He stopped. He built a fire. Not for warmth, the desert night had not yet grown cold. For company, for the illusion of companionship that a dancing flame provides to a solitary person in a vast empty space. He gathered dry brush and arranged it in a pyramid, struck his flint, nursed the first spark into a flame, and watched as the flame grew and spread and transformed the pile of dead wood into a living, breathing, light-producing entity. Fire fascinated the scholar in a way that was different now from how it had fascinated him before the scroll. Before, fire was chemistry, combustion, oxidation, the rapid conversion of carbon-based fuel into heat and light and ash. Simple, explainable, categorizable. But now, after weeks of reading about a being who existed outside the categories of the explainable, fire seemed like something more, something mysterious. Something that sat on the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical, transforming matter into energy with a casual disregard for the solid, reliable, reassuring rules of material existence. Fire was transformation, and transformation was what Melchizedek represented. The transformation of the known into the unknown, the transformation of the temporal into the eternal, the transformation of a scholar's neat, orderly, comprehensible world into a vast, terrifying, beautiful mystery. The scholar knelt beside his fire and prayed, not the formal, structured prayer of a man performing a religious obligation, a raw prayer, a desperate prayer, a prayer that came not from his mind, but from the deepest, most honest, most frightened part of his soul, the part that lay beneath his education, beneath his sophistication, beneath his decades of accumulated knowledge and carefully constructed worldview. "Who are you?" he whispered into the darkness. "What are you? Why have you led me here? Why have you shown me these things? What do you want from me?" The fire crackled and spat sparks into the air. The sparks rose like tiny orange stars, climbing for a moment before winking out and disappearing into the infinite darkness above. The scholar watched them go and felt a kinship with them, brief, bright, temporary creatures born from something larger than themselves, burning for a moment before dissolving back into the darkness from which they came. He was a spark. Everyone was a spark, brief, bright, temporary. But Melchizedek was the fire, permanent, enduring, the source from which all sparks emerged and to which all sparks returned. The thought made the scholar's stomach clench with a fear so primal it predated language. This was not the fear of danger or the fear of death. This was the fear of insignificance, the fear that comes when a finite being catches a glimpse of the infinite and realizes with crushing clarity just how small it truly is, just how brief, just how limited, just how temporary. And then, as if in response to his prayer, as if the darkness itself had been waiting for him to ask the question, he felt it, a presence, not behind him, not beside him, not in any specific direction, everywhere, a presence that was not localized but ambient, not concentrated but diffuse, not arriving but revealing, revealing that it had always been there, always watching, always waiting, always present in the space between the sand grains and the space between the stars and the space between the thoughts in the scholar's overwhelmed and reeling mind. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, and there, at the very edge of visibility, where the orange glow of the campfire dissolved into the blue-black void of the desert night, he saw them. Eyes. Not human eyes, not animal eyes, eyes that glowed with a soft, warm, amber light that was neither reflected firelight nor any other explainable illumination. They were simply there, 2 points of golden luminescence floating in the darkness at a height that suggested a tall figure standing at the periphery of the light. The scholar's breath stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs with a violence that he could feel in his fingertips and his temples and the base of his throat. The eyes did not blink. They did not move. They simply watched, calm, patient, ancient. The wind rose suddenly, a gust that came from nowhere and hit the scholar's fire hard enough to bend the flames sideways, sending a shower of sparks streaming horizontally across the sand. The scholar's robe snapped and billowed around him, and he raised his arm instinctively to shield his face from the wind-driven sand that stung his skin like needles. When the gust passed and the fire recovered, the scholar lowered his arm and looked back at the spot where the eyes had been. Nothing. Empty darkness, flat sand, cold air, the absence of presence so complete that it felt like the presence of absence, a void where something had been, a gap in the fabric of the night that was shaped like whatever had been standing there moments before. The scholar scrambled to his feet and took 3 quick steps towards the spot. His sandals crunched on sand that should have shown footprints if anything had been standing there. He knelt and examined the ground in the dying light of his disturbed fire. No footprints, no impressions of any kind. The sand was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had stood there for years, as if the eyes he had seen were a hallucination, a projection of his frightened mind, a symptom of exhaustion and dehydration and the psychological stress of weeks spent reading about impossible things. But the scholar knew better. He knew because the scroll in his bag had gone cold, completely cold. For the first time since he had opened it, the parchment was no longer warm. It was as cold as the desert night, as cold as the stone beneath his knees, as cold as the empty space where the glowing eyes had been. The presence had withdrawn, and the scroll had responded, because they were connected, the scroll and the presence, the text and the reality it represented, the words on the parchment and the reality they represented. The scroll was not about Melchizedek. The scroll was from Melchizedek. The scholar sat beside his dying fire for hours, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead in their ancient, predictable mathematical dance. The stars, at least, were reliable. The stars obeyed laws. The stars could be plotted and predicted and understood through the application of reason and observation and careful measurement. But Melchizedek obeyed no laws. Melchizedek could not be plotted or predicted. Melchizedek existed in a realm where reason and observation and measurement were not the currency of understanding, where something else was required, something that the scholar had spent his entire life avoiding, because it was the antithesis of everything his scholarly training had taught him to value: faith. Not the faith of the simple believer who accepts what they are told because they lack the tools to question it. Not the faith of the desperate person who clings to belief because the alternative is despair. A different kind of faith entirely. The faith of the scholar who has pursued knowledge to its absolute limit and discovered that at the boundary of the knowable, a vast territory of the unknowable begins, and that this territory is not empty, but full. Not dark, but luminous, not meaningless, but saturated with a meaning so profound and so total that the human mind can only approach it by surrendering the very tools it has relied upon to approach everything else. The scholar had reached that boundary. He was standing at the edge of the knowable, looking out into the luminous darkness of the unknowable, and the being who inhabited that darkness, the priest without beginning or end, the king of a city that existed beyond the borders of the physical world, was looking back at him. And the question was not whether the scholar could understand Melchizedek. The question was whether
the story the scholar was piecing together, the story the scrolls were revealing, fragment by fragment, glow by glow, reached backward through the centuries to a moment that had been recorded in the most sacred of all texts, a moment that had been read by millions, discussed by thousands, debated by hundreds, and truly understood by almost no one. The moment when Abraham met Melchizedek. The scene unfolded in the scholar's mind not as a distant historical event, but as a living, breathing, present-tense experience, as vivid and immediate as if he were standing on the mountainside himself, feeling the morning sun on his face and the battle dust in his lungs. Abraham was walking. He was walking the way a man walks after he has done something impossible, after he has fought a battle he should have lost, after he has rescued people who should have remained captive, after he has defied kings and armies with a force that was ridiculously, laughably inadequate by any rational military assessment. He was walking with the stunned, mechanical gait of someone whose body is moving forward while his mind is still standing on the battlefield, still surrounded by the clash and scream and blood of combat, still trying to process the fact that he is alive. His servants walked behind him, a ragged collection of men who had been transformed in a single night from household workers into warriors. They carried the spoils of battle, weapons, armor, supplies, treasures taken from the defeated kings whose armies had scattered into the darkness when Abraham's tiny force had struck with the devastating precision that only divine guidance could explain. They were exhausted. Their faces were masks of dust and dried blood, and the particular hollow-eyed emptiness that comes from having killed other human beings and not yet having had time to reckon with the moral and psychological weight of that act. Some of them walked in silence, others murmured prayers. One young man at the back of the group was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Abraham led them eastward, toward the Valley of the King, where he had been told, by a message delivered through means the text did not specify, that someone was waiting for him. Someone important. Someone who would give him something he did not know he needed. The light appeared first. Not sunlight. The sun was already up, already pouring its familiar warmth across the mountain landscape. This was a different light. A light that seemed to have its own source, its own physics, its own relationship with the space it occupied. It appeared on the horizon as a bright point, a star that had not been there a moment before, shining in the blue morning sky with a brilliance that made the sun look dim by comparison. Abraham stopped walking. His hand went to his eyes instinctively, shielding them from the approaching radiance. Behind him, his servants stopped as well, some of them reaching for weapons with the reflexive caution of men who had just fought a battle and were still primed for threats. But this was no threat. Even the most battle-hardened among them could feel that. Whatever was approaching carried an authority that transcended military power, that made swords and spears and shields feel not just inadequate, but absurd. The light grew closer, and within it, a figure became visible. A man, walking. Tall and straight, his posture perfect, his stride unhurried. He wore a robe of white that the light seemed to emanate from rather than merely illuminate. The fabric itself appeared to be a source of radiance, each thread woven from something that was more light than fiber, more energy than matter. His face was visible only in outline at first, a strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes set deep beneath a broad forehead. But as he drew closer and the light softened enough to allow details to emerge, his features became clear. He was neither old nor young. This was the first thing Abraham noticed, and it confused him in a way that nothing else about the encounter did. The man's face bore none of the marks of age, no wrinkles, no sagging skin, no clouded eyes, no liver spots, but neither did it carry the softness of youth. No lingering baby fat, no uncertainty in the jawline, no unfinished quality that marks a face still being shaped by time and experience. The face was complete, finished, settled into its final form with the same permanence that a mountain settles into its final form, not because it has reached the end of a process, but because it has always been this way. Because there was no process, because the face was not the result of aging, but the result of being. This was Melchizedek. Abraham knelt. He did not decide to kneel. His knees simply buckled, not from weakness, but from recognition. Something inside Abraham, something deeper than his muscles, deeper than his bones, deeper than the neurological pathways that controlled his motor functions, recognized the approaching figure and responded with an involuntary act of submission that bypassed his conscious mind entirely. His knees hit the dusty ground, and the impact sent a small cloud of sand rising around his legs. His head bowed forward, his chin touching his chest, his eyes closing. He looked like a man who had been carrying an impossibly heavy load for an impossibly long time and finally found a place to set it down. Behind him, his soldiers stood frozen in a tableau of confusion. They had followed Abraham into battle. They had trusted his leadership. They had risked their lives on his judgment. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for this moment. Their leader, the man who had defeated 4 kings in a single night, was on his knees before a stranger who had appeared from a ball of light on the horizon. Some of the soldiers gripped their weapons tighter. Others let their weapons slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. One soldier, the young man who had been crying, fell to his knees as well, though he could not explain why. Abraham Melchizedek reached Abraham and stopped. He stood over the kneeling patriarch with an expression that was simultaneously tender and terrible, the tenderness of a parent looking at a beloved child, the terribleness of a power so vast and so ancient that the human mind could only process it as something akin to the sublime terror of standing at the edge of an infinite void and realizing that the void is not empty, but full. Melchizedek spoke. The scroll did not record his words. This absence was, the scholar realized, deliberate. Whatever Melchizedek said to Abraham in that moment was not meant for the scroll, not meant for future readers, not meant for posterity with scholarship. It was meant for Abraham alone, a private communication between the eternal and the temporal, the infinite and the finite, the priest who had no beginning and the man who had been chosen to become the father of nations. Then came the offering. Melchizedek produced bread and wine, not from a bag or a basket or any visible container, but simply produced them, the way the morning produces dew, the way spring produces flowers, the way silence produces peace. One moment his hands were empty. The next moment they held a round loaf of bread in one palm and a cup of wine in the other. The bread was ordinary, simple, the kind of bread that any woman in any village could produce from flour and water and fire. It was brown and round and slightly warm, with a crust that was cracked in places and a surface dusted with coarse grain. There was nothing miraculous about its appearance. But when Melchizedek broke it, when his long, elegant fingers gripped the loaf on either side and pulled it apart with a clean, decisive motion, something happened that the ordinary appearance of the bread could not explain. A fragrance rose from the breaking point. Not the familiar smell of fresh bread, something deeper, something richer, something that activated not just the olfactory senses, but the memory and the emotion and the deepest longing of every person present. It smelled like home. Not any specific home, not the home that Abraham had left when he departed from Ur, not the tents that his servants returned to each night. Home as a concept. Home as the place where everything is right and nothing is wrong, and the soul is at rest, and the heart is at peace, and the mind is free from the relentless, exhausting, never-ending work of trying to make sense of a world that refuses to make sense. The wine was the same, ordinary in a cup, dark red, slightly thick, the kind of wine that was produced in every vineyard in the region. But when Melchizedek poured it, when the liquid left the cup and arced through the air in a thin, glistening stream that caught the light and broke it into thousands of tiny rainbows, the wine became something else, something sacred. Something that transformed the simple act of pouring liquid from one vessel into another into a ritual so ancient and so powerful that it predated every religion, every temple, every altar, every priesthood that had ever existed. Because this was the original ritual. This was the act from which all subsequent sacred acts would derive their power and their meaning. Every time a bread would be broken at an altar, every time a wine would be poured at a ceremony, every time a priest would stand before a congregation and perform the sacred rites of communion and offering and sacrifice, they would be echoing this moment, this specific moment, this bread, this wine, these hands, this priest. Melchizedek placed his hand on Abraham's bowed head. The touch was gentle, the weight of the hand no more than the weight of any human hand resting on any human head, but the effect was seismic. A pulse of light, warm, golden, substantial, erupted from the point of contact and expanded outward in a spherical shockwave that washed over the landscape like a...
The scholar turned the scroll to its next section and entered a part of the text that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was a catalog, a record, a meticulous century-by-century account of Melchizedek's appearances throughout human history, each one documented by a different hand, in a different language, from a different civilization, but each one describing the same being with the same face, the same robe, the same eyes, the same calm, serene, impossibly patient expression. The first account after Abraham described a city that the scholar did not recognize, a city of white stone and blue-tiled rooftops, nestled in a valley between two rivers, its marketplace fragrant with spices that the scholar could almost smell through the centuries-old parchment. In this city, a king ruled, a powerful king, a feared king, a king whose armies had conquered every neighboring territory and whose treasury was the envy of the known world. This king had everything a man could desire: power, wealth, territory, obedience, fear. And yet, the king was troubled. The scroll described his trouble with the precision of a physician diagnosing an illness. The sleepless nights, the loss of appetite, the growing sense that something was wrong with the world, that something fundamental was missing from his life, that all his conquests and all his treasures and all his power were decorations on the surface of an emptiness that grew deeper with each passing year.
The king had tried everything to fill this emptiness. He had built temples and commissioned statues and endowed priests with lavish salaries. He had married beautiful women and fathered strong sons, and surrounded himself with musicians and poets and philosophers who competed for his attention with performances and arguments and flattery. Nothing worked. The emptiness remained. And then, one morning, without announcement or invitation, Melchizedek appeared in the king's throne room. The doors of the throne room did not open. They simply were open, one moment closed, the next moment standing wide, as though the concept of closed had been temporarily suspended in the vicinity of the approaching figure. Light poured through the opening with such intensity that the courtiers standing nearest to the doors staggered backward, their hands flying to their eyes, their mouths opening in cries that were swallowed by the silence that accompanied the light. Because there was silence. Complete, absolute, annihilating silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the silence of a room from which the very possibility of sound had been removed. The silence of a vacuum, the silence of space, the silence that exists before the universe began and will exist after it ends. The courtiers' mouths moved, but produced nothing. The guards' armor did not clink. The king's throne did not creak. Even the flames in the oil lamps that lined the walls burned without the faintest whisper of combustion. Into this silence Melchizedek walked. His steps produced no sound on the marble floor. His robe did not rustle. His breath, if he breathed, was inaudible. He moved through the throne room like a figure in a dream, present and vivid and real, but operating under different rules than the physical world around him, exempt from the ordinary constraints of matter and energy and cause and effect. The king saw him and understood immediately. Not intellectually, not through any process of recognition or analysis. He understood the way the earth understands the sun, instinctively, fundamentally, with every particle of his being responding to the presence before him, the way iron filings respond to a magnet. The emptiness that had been consuming him for years, the void at the center of his power and his wealth and his conquests, suddenly had a shape, a cause, an explanation. He had been empty because he had been missing this. He had been missing the eternal. And now the eternal was standing in his throne room, looking at him with eyes that had seen the birth of the stars and would see the death of the last sun. And the king realized, with a clarity that was simultaneously devastating and liberating, that every throne he had ever sat upon, every crown he had ever worn, every army he had ever commanded, every treasure he had ever hoarded, was a substitute, a placeholder, a cheap imitation of the authority and the power and the wealth that radiated from the being standing before him. The king descended from his throne. Not with measured dignity of a royal procession, with the desperate, stumbling, graceless urgency of a drowning man reaching for a rope. He half walked, half fell down the steps of his dais, his crown tilting on his head, his royal robes tangling around his ankles, his trembling legs barely supporting his weight. And when he reached the bottom, when he stood on the same level as Melchizedek, stripped of the artificial elevation that his throne provided, he dropped to his knees, and the emptiness filled. Melchizedek placed both hands on the king's shoulders. The touch sent a pulse of golden light through the king's body, visible light, passing through flesh and bone and muscle, the way sunlight passes through water, illuminating internal structures that the naked eye was never meant to see. For a moment, a brief, transcendent, impossibly intimate moment, the king was transparent. His physical body became a window through which the light of Melchizedek's touch could be seen, radiating outward through his chest and abdomen and limbs, like a lamp placed inside a clay vessel. The courtiers fell. Not one by one, but simultaneously, a a cascade of collapsing bodies that looked like a field of wheat being flattened by a sudden wind. Knees hit marble, foreheads hit marble, hands spread flat against cold stone. The collective impact produced the first sound that anyone in the room had heard since Melchizedek's arrival, a deep, resonant thud that echoed off the high ceiling and the distant walls and seemed to vibrate in the air long after the physical sound had faded. And then, just as quickly as the silence had come, sound returned. The oil lamps crackled. The king's breathing, rapid, shallow, desperate, became audible. The rustling of dozens of robes as courtiers pressed themselves against the floor filled the room with a soft, continuous whisper of fabric against stone. And through it all, a new sound, a sound that no one in the room could identify, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that was not quite music, and not quite speech, and not quite silence, but some impossible combination of all three. The sound of eternity. The sound of a reality so vast and so deep that it generated its own acoustic signature, a hum, a resonance, a frequency that was normally below the threshold of human hearing, but that became audible in the presence of the being who embodied it. The courtiers heard it in their chests rather than their ears. The king felt it in his bones. And Melchizedek, the source of the sound, stood at the center of it like the eye of a hurricane, calm and still, while the reality he represented swirled around him with overwhelming force. The scroll accelerated. The scholar's eyes raced across the text as account after account poured from the ancient parchment, each one describing the same figure, each one documenting the same unchanged face, each one occurring in a different century, a different civilization, a different corner of the ancient world. The effect was cumulative and devastating. One account could be dismissed as legend, 2 could be dismissed as coincidence, 3 could be dismissed as a pattern-seeking mind, finding connections where none existed. But dozens, scores, centuries of consistent, detailed, independently documented encounters with the same being? That could not be dismissed. Melchizedek appeared in a desert kingdom where the sun burned so hot that the sand fused into glass. He appeared in a mountain stronghold where the air was so thin that ordinary men gasped for breath. He appeared in a coastal city where the salt spray turned everything, buildings, clothing, skin, a perpetual white gray. He appeared in forests so dense that sunlight could not reach the ground. He appeared in palaces and in prisons, in temples and in taverns, in moments of triumph and in moments of devastation. And in every appearance he was the same height, the same build, the same white robe, the same ageless face, the same calm, penetrating, impossibly patient expression. The same serene expression that communicated without words a truth that defied verbal articulation. I have always been here. I will always be here. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The scholar tried to imagine what it would be like to encounter the same face across millennia, to be a being who existed in the time of Abraham, and also in the time of David, and also in the time of the exile, and also in the time of the scholar himself, existing not
Night fell on the ancient city like a curtain drawn across the face of the world, and in the darkness, the scholar climbed to the rooftop above his room and looked up at the stars. He had been reading for hours, days. He had lost track. The scroll had consumed him, or perhaps he had consumed the scroll, absorbing its words into his bloodstream the way roots absorb water, the way lungs absorb air, the way the soul absorbs truth when truth is finally presented in a form that the soul can recognize and accept. And now, standing on the rooftop with the desert wind in his hair and the infinite expanse of the heavens above him, the scholar saw something that made his knees weak and his heart pound, and his mind reel with an understanding so vast that it threatened to overwhelm every circuit in his neurological system. The stars were moving. Not in their normal, predictable astronomical paths, the slow, stately procession across the sky that every astronomer could calculate and every sailor could navigate by. They were moving with purpose, with intent, with the deliberate, unmistakable choreography of an intelligence arranging pieces on a board. Stars were sliding from their familiar positions and converging in new configurations, configurations that the scholar recognized because he had seen them before. On the scroll, the symbols that Melchizedek had drawn in the sand for the young man on the hillside, the symbols carved above the city gate, the symbols that glowed in the margin of the ancient text, those same symbols were now being written across the face of the sky in letters of stellar fire, each one composed of dozens of stars drawn together from across the constellation, each one burning with a brightness that exceeded the normal luminosity of any individual star. The heavens were becoming a scroll, and the message they spelled out in characters older than any human alphabet, in a language that predated speech itself, was the same message that the parchment scroll contained, the same truth, the same revelation, the same devastating, beautiful, universe-shaking reality about the being who had been appearing to humanity since before humanity existed. The sky was confirming what the scroll had been saying, not because the sky was a copy of the scroll, because the scroll was a copy of the sky. Both were expressions of the same eternal truth. Both were written by the same eternal hand. Both pointed to the same eternal reality. Melchizedek had not merely appeared in human history. He had written himself into the very structure of the cosmos. The scholar descended from the rooftop with the speed that his old body should not have been capable of producing. His legs moved with the urgency of a man who has seen a fire approaching and must warn everyone before it arrives. His hands gripped the wrapped scrolls against his chest as he ran through the darkening streets, the wind rising around him, carrying the first cold drops of rain that would soon become a storm of supernatural proportions. He burst into the underground chamber to find the elders already assembled. They had felt it too. The building pressure, the atmospheric distortion, the sense that the membrane between worlds was stretching to its breaking point. They sat in their circle around the stone table, their faces gray with exhaustion and anticipation, their hands gripping the edges of their benches as if holding on against a force that threatened to pull them from their seats and hurl them into the unknown. The scholar slammed the scrolls onto the table. He did not speak. There was no time for speech, no need for explanation, no language adequate to describe what was coming. He simply looked at each elder in turn, and each elder looked back, and in the exchange of gazes, a complete communication occurred, a transfer of understanding so rapid and so total that it would have taken hours to accomplish through words. They knew. They all knew. The final revelation was approaching. The scrolls on the table began to glow. Softly at first, the familiar golden luminescence that the scholar had been observing for weeks, but then brighter and brighter and brighter still, until the light coming from the ancient text was not a glow, but a blaze, a fierce, unrestrained, almost violent outpouring of radiance that turned the underground chamber into a furnace of golden fire. The stone table underneath the scrolls began to vibrate, and the vibration communicated itself to the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the very bedrock beneath the building, a deep, resonant tremor that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself, accelerating toward a climax. The text lifted from the scroll. Individual letters, ancient, pre-alphabetic symbols that had been inked onto parchment centuries ago, peeled themselves free from the surface and rose into the air like embers from a fire. They floated, They swirled, they rearranged themselves into new patterns that no human scribe had written, patterns that the scroll had contained in potential but had never before expressed, hidden messages encrypted in the arrangement of the visible text, waiting for this moment, this specific convergence of time and place and people to reveal themselves. And now the light concentrated. It pulled inward from every direction, gathering itself from the walls and the ceiling and the floor and the floating letters, compressing into a single vertical beam that shot straight upward from the table with a force that punched through the stone ceiling as if the stone were water. The beam continued upward, through the building above, through the storm clouds that had gathered over the city, through the atmosphere itself, a pillar of golden white light connecting the underground chamber to the heavens with the straightness and solidity of a column supporting a cosmic roof. Outside, the city saw it. Every person in every street, every room, every building saw the pillar of light split the storm clouds and reach toward the stars, and every person who saw it stopped whatever they were doing and stared upward with the instinctive, reflexive awe of a creature witnessing something so far beyond its comprehension that the only possible response is silent, motionless wonder. Inside the chamber, within the pillar of light, he appeared. Not gradually this time, not gently, not with the measured, controlled revelation of previous appearances. This time, Melchizedek materialized with the full, unrestrained, cataclysmic force of his eternal nature, a garment made of compressed light, each thread a beam of radiance, each fold a cascade of brilliance that hurt to look at directly. His face, that ageless, serene, impossibly beautiful face, was shining with an intensity that turned every previous appearance into a shadow, a sketch, a rough draft of the masterpiece that was now being revealed. His eyes were open, and his eyes were everything. They contained the universe, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. When the scholar looked into Melchizedek's eyes, looked past the surface, past the iris, past the pupil, into the depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the skull, he saw stars. He saw galaxies. He saw the birth of matter and the death of suns, and the patient, eons-long process by which cosmic dust became planets, and planets became homes for life, and life became consciousness, and consciousness became the capacity to wonder, to question, to seek, to pray, to look up at the night sky and whisper into the darkness, "Is anyone there?" Melchizedek's eyes were the answer. Someone was there. Someone had always been there. Someone would always be there. Melchizedek spread his arms, and creation unfolded around him, not as a story or a vision or a dream, as reality. The underground chamber ceased to exist, or rather it expanded beyond any possibility of measurement, its stone walls stretching outward to encompass everything that had ever existed or would ever exist. The scholar and the elders found themselves floating in a space that was simultaneously intimate and infinite, surrounded by the unfolding panorama of all of time. They saw the beginning. Not the beginning as described in sacred texts, the scholarly, theological, carefully worded account that generations of scribes had polished and refined. They saw the beginning as it actually happened, raw, unedited, unfiltered, presenting itself to their mortal senses with a directness that was almost physically painful. They saw light emerging from nothing. They saw matter coalescing from energy. They saw the first stars ignite like matches struck in an infinite dark room, each one a miracle of physics, so complex and so precise that the odds against it occurring by chance were numbers too large for the human mind to conceive. And through it all, they saw Melchizedek. He was there, at the beginning, before the beginning. He was there when the first photon of light burst into existence. He was there when the first hydrogen atom formed.